Now, more than 1 million people have already downloaded the government's contact tracing app for England and Wales on its first day of release. Anyone over 16 is being encouraged to use it on their smartphone. It can warn if you've been in close contact with someone who's been infected, but the Health Secretary for England, Matt Hancock, says it won't be a legal requirement for people to self-isolate if the app says you should. Here's our medical editor, Fergus Walsh.
Now, based on Apple and Google's privacy-preserving technology, the app will help us safely live our lives, protecting you and others.
Much delayed, but finally available for download in England and Wales. The NHS COVID-19 app can be used to check in at bars and restaurants and tell you the coronavirus risk level where you live. But its main function is contact tracing. The app uses Bluetooth, and if you come into contact with others who've downloaded it, that will be recorded on each of the phones. Now, let's say I test positive. That result will be sent anonymously to the NHS. If I'd been within 2 meters of someone for at least 15 minutes, perhaps sat near them on a train, they'll be sent an alert telling them to self-isolate. The app keeps secret who's received those alerts, so self-isolation will be voluntary, unlike those contacted through NHS Test and Trace, where it's mandatory.
This allows us to find, all of us, to find contacts that we wouldn't otherwise know. Because if you've been sitting near somebody on a bus, for instance, you might not know who they are. So if you test positive, you couldn't tell the contact tracers that.
1 million people downloaded Scotland's tracing app within a week of its launch. Northern Ireland's app has also proved popular. For those with COVID symptoms, finding out fast whether they're infected is vital so that contacts can be traced. New figures show that fewer than 1 in 3 people in England who attended a COVID testing site are getting their results within 24 hours. It was a return to homeschooling for the Maguire family from Cambridgeshire last week after 2-year-old Sean got a fever. They managed to book a test slot.
Getting a test like that, and one that we didn't have to travel 150 miles for, it was a half-an-hour drive, so actually I thought, well, this is really good.
But a week on, they never heard back.
We still don't have the government's test and trace result. Day 8. It's so frustrating, actually. It felt so much worse than the original lockdown.
In the end, they paid £150 for a private test and got the result last night.
Negative.
Yay! The government has set a target of 500,000 tests a day by the end of October, double the amount done now. But making sure people get their results back quickly will be another challenge. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
Denmark is among 4 countries from where travellers arriving in the UK will have to self-isolate for 2 weeks. Restrictions are also being reimposed on arrivals from Iceland, Slovakia and the Caribbean island of Curaçao due to rising coronavirus cases. The quarantine measures come into effect from 4 a.m. on Saturday. Cardiff is facing a local lockdown as coronavirus cases rise rapidly. The City Council leader, Hugh Thomas, was warned of potential restrictions on travel and different households mixing. He told a virtual meeting of the authority that in the past 7 days, the city has seen more than 38 cases per 100,000 people. Scottish students studying at universities in Scotland have been told they'll break the law if they leave their accommodation and return home to stay with their families. Now, it comes after a major coronavirus outbreak at Glasgow University, where 172 cases have been confirmed. They've also been told to stay away from pubs and bars for the rest of the week. More than 1,000 students are estimated to be self-isolating after outbreaks in Dundee, St Andrews and Aberdeen. Here's our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith.
Students in pubs, it is to be expected. But in Scotland, from this weekend, they're all being told to stay out of bars and restaurants. It is a pretty drastic move. So students not going to pubs, is that going to work?
I think it's obviously the right advice to, we should be maintaining a social distance and stuff, but to be honest, really, I don't think it's very realistic.
I think if there's a limit for people to go out until 10 o'clock, I don't see why it should exclude students.
At the Glasgow University Halls of Residence, a testing site is producing more positive results, and each confirmed case puts a whole flat of 10 or 12 students into total lockdown.
This is a 12-person flat in Murano.
This is our kitchen.
with all our occupants here. Very dirty.
Tuition continues with online lectures. 3 of these students have confirmed coronavirus, so they can't even get out to the laundrette.
Obviously, staying inside for 2 weeks after moving to this flat, like only being here for a week, and meeting these people, knowing these people for a week, and now having to stay with them for 2 weeks, not able to leave the place, is quite challenging.
This is really tough for teenagers away from home for the first time. But students are not allowed to go back to families who live in Scotland. The authorities say they can't point to one single source of this outbreak. They do know there were quite a lot of block parties in these halls of residence early last week. Now, although that is against the rules, given that it was the first few days of Freshers' Week, it's probably not a total shock. Glasgow's not the only university with a coronavirus outbreak, and critics say these problems should have been anticipated. Tougher measures to restrict students' movements and enforce the social distancing rules are now being introduced.
I can imagine just how awful this is for students right now. My own nephew has just started at university in Edinburgh and is living in halls of residence, so I think we all know from relatives we don't want our young people to be living with this, but it is really important that students recognise the risk to themselves and the risk to others and follow all the guidance.
500 students at Dundee's Abertay University are isolating, as are students in Aberdeen, Edinburgh and St Andrews. As universities start back in England and Wales, what's happening in Scotland could well be replicated. Cases have been confirmed on campuses across the UK. The University and College Union say students should be staying home and learning online instead. And no one can say whether students might find themselves confined to their halls of residence over the Christmas holidays. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Glasgow.
New curfew restrictions for pubs and restaurants in England and Wales have just come into force this evening. And our correspondent Duncan Kennedy is outside a pub in Southampton for us tonight. Duncan, the punters there had to leave by 10. How did it go down?
Well, just about 20 minutes ago, it was 10 o'clock, Clive, and that's exactly what happens. All the pubs, clubs and bars in this area closed, and people have started making their way home. It all ended exactly on time, as required by the law. How did it go down with punters and managers? Well, it's been a bit of a mixed response from punters, certainly. Many we spoke to said this is the right thing to do. It was reasonable in order to get COVID down. But there have been a few we've spoken to who have said, what's the point of closing just 1 hour earlier? Because they say they're only going to drink more up until 10 o'clock anyway. So far as managers are concerned, well, they say it's more serious for them because it affects their business plans. We spoke to one owner of a restaurant chain, and he said he's had to make 500 phone calls to try and rearrange his dinner appointments, including asking some people to turn up to dinner at 6 p.m, which he said is completely unfeasible. But the government insists this is the way forward, this is the way to keep crowds down. So from tonight here in England, all these bars, clubs and restaurants will be closed from 10 o'clock.
OK, Duncan, thank you. Duncan Kennedy there in Southampton.